All right, gang. Here we are. We're in Chapter 5 now, and let's talk about power supplies. Now, if you were to look at a normal power supply that might go in a computer, you might see a number of different kinds of connectors. We'll talk about the different kinds of connectors. I've got videos already that walk you through individually the appearance. And if it's a face-to-face class, we actually do hands-on touching and seeing how they go together. They're fairly easy to recognize over time. It just sometimes takes a little bit of time to get used to them. So let's start off with the power coming from the power supply. And the power coming from the power supply will traditionally have a PATA, or we'll call the power cable coming off of it a Molex connection. The Molex connection goes to a PATA hard drive or a PATA device. If it's a SATA drive, it'll have a SATA power connection. And a SATA power connection, it's a 15-pin connection. And it's got voltages for 3.3 volts, 5 volts, 12 volts. And it may rarely use 3.3 volts. It's still there in case it is needed, and that's just the typical configuration. Now, you'll see in many cases a combination where it's a power supply that can handle both a Molex or a SATA power need, if you will. So if you decided, I want to swap off, or for some reason I needed to connect a PATA drive, as long as you had the capability to connect that drive to the motherboard, we've got the ability to have a diverse power supply. Okay. So we also have a connection it might be labeled ATX 12 or ATX V12. And it's a connection that will connect to the storage devices, and we're talking about the Molex connection. And they may say P4 on them. We may have you're plugging a 4-pin connector, depending on what we're plugging in, where we're plugging in. We have on our power supply, we've got a 4-pin connector. We've got a 8-pin, which we'll traditionally call a 4+4. Now, we can feed power to the motherboard for the fans. We can feed power to the motherboard for the CPU itself. They both require specific or dedicated power. Aside from that, we've got coming into the power supply itself, we've got coming in, it's either 120 or 240 volts, or some may say 115 and 220. And on the back of the power supply, we'll have a little toggle, and we can toggle that power supply for the specific input of power. That power supply will modify or transition that power from that voltage down to 12 volts and less. Now, we'll see this in a laptop, and it's all integrated into the cable. So when you look at a power supply for a laptop, the power supply has a cord plug in the wall, just like any power cable for any other electric device. But within that cable, you'll see a black rectangular box, and in that rectangular box are pretty much the same components that we have in our power supply in a standard desktop computer system, for the most part. Now, the output connections, our desktop has many output connections going to specific devices within the system unit. On a laptop, however, you have a single input, and then that power is distributed throughout the system. Now, the power may be brought down to lower voltages within the system, but most of the power transformation is taking place in that little box that's an inline box in the power cord. Okay. So, depending on what kind of motherboard we've got and the types of power requirements for the expansion cards. Now, I can have PCI Express, and traditionally I would have a 20-pin power connector, but with a PCI Express, those motherboards will have a 24-pin power connector coming to the motherboard. So it's very important, just like we spoke previously, to have an understanding of what the requirements are for your specific system before you decide to go purchase anything as a replacement part. We have to know how this system, or how this part, I should say, integrates within the system. How does it connect? What are the power requirements for the system as a whole? Okay. We always make sure that we have powered down the system to discharge the system by holding the power button on the computer down for at least 5 seconds, hopefully 10 or more, to discharge any power within the system, and we're using an anti-static bracelet to discharge any electrostatic charge we may have on our bodies. And we keep in mind, these capacitors that are in these power supplies, they do hold power, and we need to manually discharge them by holding that power supply down, or that power button down, for that period of time. Okay. So I'll see you in Chapter 6, and keep up the hard work.